And Frank,
hello
I saw
everyone.
Frank there.
Hi, hello everyone. Welcome to the MIT Mobility Forum. I'm Jinhua Zhao, Professor of Cities and Transportation at MIT. There are three landmark bills: the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, the Inflation Reduction Act, the Chips and Science Act. Together promise to invest substantially in our infrastructure, climate, science, and technology. Much of them directly touch the transportation industry and research. It's a once in generational opportunity to transform America's mobility system. Today, it's such a pleasure to have Liz Reynolds and David Mindell to join us and share their thoughts on the tectonic shift in science, technology, and industry policy. I invite Liz and David to not only give us the big picture of what's going on, but also give 2 or 3 concrete examples in the act. How are they construed? What are the tensions in the negotiation? What do they mean for cities and transportation, maybe a particular neighborhood, particular community here? And also, what does it mean for average person in the neighborhood? Why we should care on this, right? Before I formally introduce Liz and David, I do want to reinforce the norm of this forum, which is everybody contribute one idea, either in the form of question or comments, and type into the chat, right? Just to warm up the audience, I prepared a poll. I will project it now, asking to what degree are the 3 acts, RJA, RA, and CHIPS connected to your own practice? Right, so I will start the poll here. I just launched it. So to what degree the 3 acts connect to your own practice? Probably the strongest forms I contribute to the development of the RJA, the act itself, right? Then the second one is related to my own practice significantly, or related to in a partial way, or I'm just curious. Okay, I'll give 3 more seconds. 1, 2, 3. So I'll end the poll and share the result. So indeed, a couple of us in the audience actually contributed to the act writing themselves. That's great. And about 20% relate to the practice significantly, and 20% related partially, and half of us interested in the conversation here. Great. And the second exercise is I like everybody in the chat type in your organization, city, and local time, just to give Liz and David a background of who the audience are. So I will start in the chat. I would say MIT, Cambridge, Massachusetts. Time is 12:07 p.m. So University of New Mexico, Edgecombe, Vilas, Quito, Northwestern, Equity, USDOT Volpe, UW Medicine, Qualcomm, NTA, Office of Sustainability, MIT. Next are World Bank, Department of Air Force, ILP. Thank you. Thank you for sharing this information. Hopefully give some context for Liz and David on this. Right. So let me introduce Liz and David. Liz and I were classmates at MIT many years ago. She researched on national and regional system of innovation, as well as the manufacturing ecosystem and scale up. She was a special assistant to the President Biden for manufacturing and economic development at the National Economic Council until just last October. During her time at the White House, she helped lead the administration's work on supply chains, national manufacturing strategy, regional economic development, and the broader industry policy agenda. Reynolds was the executive director of the MIT's Industrial Performance Center for a decade, as well as the executive director for the MIT Task Force on the Work of the Future. Welcome to join us, Liz. And David Mindell actually has spoken in this forum twice. He's a professor of aeroastro and professor of history of engineering and manufacturing. He has this unique combination of engineering and humanity, which is precisely what needed to understand the mobility challenges in the society today. He also co-chaired the task force on the work of the future. He wrote 6 books, so including the work of the future with Liz Reynolds on this. He also co-founded humanities cooperation, also co-founder of Unless Partner of Venture Capital. Without further ado, let me pass the forum to Liz and David, please.
Thanks, Yuna. I think I'll start out a little bit, and it's great to be back here yet again. Maybe it'll be like Saturday Night Live, where they keep records of the most invite backs. And of course, always happy to do this because it's always such an interesting conversation and a great audience. And boy, looking at that list going by on the chat really gets your brain in a global conversation, which is amazing. And I thought I'd start by putting my historian hat on a little bit and zooming out a fair amount, because there's a reason that we titled this talk The Tectonics. And just to go back 200 years to the Industrial Revolution, we've had this amazing transformation in work and technology. Many people called it the Industrial Enlightenment because the Industrial Revolution really followed on a set of big ideas about work and machinery and production and consumption and distribution. And of course, that revolution has fed and clothed all of us here. It has enabled the planet to support much larger populations with lower amounts of agrarian labor than by dramatic amounts, and has really given us the industrial life and the industrial societies that we live in today, and shaped pretty much everything about the way that we live in a modern world. And the ideas behind that original Industrial Enlightenment, I think, were very expansive and world-changing, but also missed two things as part of the core industrial philosophy that laid the groundwork for the revolution that came after. And those I would call the problem of labor. How do you get people to work in a way that's humane and fulfills their own human needs and allows them to eat and support families and live a thriving human life in a way that's equitable and share in the prosperity? And of course, the last 200 years have been marked by labor strikes, much of it quite violent in this country in the 19th century, and different forms of workplace exploitation, and that carries on today, and only exacerbated, of course, by the pandemic. And the second problem that the Industrial Enlightenment missed was the problem of environment, the extraction of natural resources, the impact on the world around us, and the sometimes and quite frequently negative after effects, whether it's on, of course, climate or toxic waste, or as we recently saw in Ohio, industrial accidents impact on the world around them. And I'll address those two in a minute. But before I do, I want to say the topic, of course, today is about government policy. And in the United States, government has played a critical role throughout this period of industrialization, and particularly in fostering technologies for mobility. One of the first contracts let by the US federal government was let to the Patriot Paul Revere here in Boston for developing techniques to roll copper for cladding of US Navy ships. Of course, the US government played a huge role in the expansion of railroads across the entire continent westward, and in patiently supporting, not far from here either, in Springfield, Massachusetts, the development of interchangeable parts production over a 4-decade period, originally for manufacturing guns, but after the US Civil War, a lot of those companies turned their attention to other consumer products like sewing machines, typewriters, and within a decade or two, bicycles. And there was a mobility craze, personal mobility craze in the late 19th century around bicycles, which is a really interesting moment, especially in light of a lot of what's going on today. And many of the same companies, and particularly the machinists and master mechanics who built those companies, soon thereafter moved out to Detroit and began building the foundations of the automobile industry. of course, a major revolution in mobility here and everywhere in the world. The US government invested in aviation for 30 years before it found really almost any kind of commercial traction in the 1930s. And of course, the electrification of the continent, urban mobility, and electric, what was called electric traction at the time, today we call it electric trains, was and continues to be a major part of a mobility system, which wouldn't have been possible without mass urban and then rural electrification. And one final example from the post-war decades, the DARPA Grand Challenges. Actually, DARPA sponsored the development of autonomous vehicles for decades, even before the Grand Challenges in the early 2000s that led to the still nascent driverless car industry. So we have a long history of government policies supporting the development of technology. And there are many different levers through which the government can make those impacts. Of course, at MIT, we're most familiar with research and R&D grants and our favorite agencies, National Science Foundation or DARPA or the Department of Transportation supporting fundamental research. But there are many, many other important ways that the government impacts technology through tax policy, through and particularly simply through procurement. The government is a massive consumer and a massive customer, and the right decision to buy the right new thing at the right time can have a huge impact on that industry. And witnessed the debates recently about the US Postal Service buying electrical postal trucks, or in the Apollo program, NASA purchased about 60% of the integrated circuits for a couple of years during a very key period in legitimating and creating a production capacity and a market for that technology. So I think today we're actually poised on the cusp of, in a way, a new kind of industrial enlightenment, and have the opportunity to rethink our industrial system in some of its fundamental ways. I'll give you one example, is the medium that we're working through here. The explosion of remote work from the pandemic, of course, it had been around for decades, never quite achieved what people thought it would achieve, has suddenly upended the way that we work, particularly in white collar work, in ways that had been settled and really took a century to settle into 9-to-5 office work, if you will. And now we're in a moment where nobody quite knows what the right answer is, certainly not MIT, and certainly not many of the small companies that I spend my time with these days, but everybody's trying to figure out a new way of working. Where do you need to live relative to your job? What parts need to be in person? What parts need to be remote? Of course, blue collar workers and service workers do not get those same benefits. And how do we offer that part of the workforce some of the advantages that are provided by these technologies? And we also have the pressing imperative for decarbonization and really rethinking our industrial system from the ground up. There was a headline from Derek Thompson's article in The Atlantic this summer around when these bills got passed, which I think captured it well, which was, for America to decarbonize, it finally realized it needed to re-industrialize and not de-industrialize. So you can think about an environmental critique of US industry going back at least to the 1970s, but even back as far as Ralph Waldo Emerson, that and Thomas Jefferson for that matter, that industry was a corruption on the landscape, the otherwise pure, which we know, of course, it wasn't, US landscape, and somehow industry is a bad thing that we should just get rid of and use less and live in a different way. At the scale of population and the country that we're in, that's not practical. And at the same time, we need to be rebuilding our industry, both for economic reasons and for climate reasons and for, in some ways, national identity. Manufacturing has been core to US identity for a very long time. In some ways, right up till the last 20, 30 years, when the economists lost sight of the fact that process innovation was intimately tied to product innovation. So we're at this incredible inflection point, and an opportunity for places like MIT, but many other individual thinkers as well, to contribute to thinking through what a new industrial era ought to look like. What are the good things that we want to draw from our history, and what things do we want to do differently? And again, I think for me, the two major categories there come into the problem of environment and the problem of labor. I'll hand it over to Liz now, because the reason that we titled this the Tectonics is I think that's an appropriate way for to describe this incredible change in US science and technology policy that happened last year. I've been studying and working on these topics and working in these topics for the 30 years that I've been at MIT, as have many of the folks on the call here. And I feel like what happened last year was the most profound change, certainly in my time at MIT, and possibly since the aftermath of Sputnik, although received relatively little public attention in that sense. And toward that end, I think the best role of government, and I hope the parts of these bills that we're most effective, are not selecting particular technologies to build. That entrepreneurs and principal investigators are extremely good at, but laying the tectonics and creating the kind of larger groundwork and pressures for people to move in the right direction. And I know a lot of deliberate thought has gone into the bills in that sense. I'll just close by saying I think this is also a story, a fairly broad one, about MIT research finding its way into the policy realm. Jinhua mentioned that Liz and I had co-chaired the Work of the Future Task Force, which wrapped up about a year and a half ago. But there are many, many people all across different parts of MIT who have been thinking about these problems for a very long time, many of them providing various inputs into the policy making system, whether it's on semiconductors, whether it's on regional economic development, whether it's on workforce development, whether it's on mobility, for example. I think there's more to be learned about it, but it's a wonderful case of problems that we've been thinking through on this campus, finding their way, at least through the legislative process, and now it remains to be implemented. So I'll turn it over to Liz, who was inside where the sausage was made, as it were, and has a unique perspective on how that all went.
Great, thank you, David. Those final points, and just remains to be implemented. We might pause on that moment, because that's what I want to talk about. It's to be with all of you, and I have to say, I left at the time, I think, just as the mobility MIT Mobility Initiative was getting off the ground, and I just commend Jinhua and everyone for this fantastic forum, and the diversity and breadth of participation today is representative of this. And there is a really important for those engaged directly in this topic. Really is a call to arms. There is so much to do, and I'm here to perhaps lay out at a high level what I think just happened in Washington and what it looks like going forward. And I also wanted to thank those who have been participating directly or indirectly with the White House on the last couple of years in specifically in shaping some of this legislation, but also dealing with some of the supply chain challenges. I know that I turned to Jinhua 3 or 4 months into the job when I was still a deer in the headlights. And as everyone has lived, we continue to have significant supply chain challenges in our transportation system and elsewhere. And I was very grateful for all the incoming support and help on bringing some of the best ideas and to bear in those moments. I'll talk a little bit about some of those issues if I can get over the PTSD in my remarks. Let me just start with perhaps an overview. As David, you really can't overstate, I think, the historic moment we're in terms of, in terms of U.S. investment in key industries and in key technologies and the sort of embracing very publicly and very forcefully industrial strategy at this moment. And I think it's important to put into context like why we might be in a position where this is now also got bipartisan support in many ways, and how we got here as a country. But just to summarize, I think some of the driving forces behind this have been, first and foremost, of course, supply chain vulnerabilities that have been exposed by the pandemic. Certainly, if you think just from PPE to semiconductors to critical minerals, it was not just national security, but economic security that has been put at risk. And so that, I think, has changed the dynamics. Existential threats due to climate change. We've seen every year now for the last couple of years, 20+ billion dollar weather events that will just continue over time, as we know. There's also the geopolitical developments. We had just gotten through, delivering everybody's presents at Christmas in December when we had the invasion of Ukraine by Russia, which again sort of changed dramatically supply chains for a couple key industries, and then of course the China-Taiwan threat that is existing, and then I think importantly for the Biden administration in particular, growing inequality and the sense that is critical to our support of democracy. We've got issues in inequality that are affecting our social fabric, the social fabric of the country, and that we need new policies and new investments to help directly address that. And so that with that landscape, I think those developments in the most recent years, but also over time, were what drove in some ways the success on the legislative agenda over the last couple of years or year plus for the Biden administration. And so Jinhua mentioned, and I will just run through again what's just been passed, the bipartisan infrastructure law, where transportation and mobility are central, where $1.1 trillion in that bill, a lot of it dedicated to energy, as well as physical and transportation infrastructure. But also importantly, we should remember that 80% of that funding is formula funding, goes directly through our state DOTs and our broadband offices, et cetera. So very critical. I think I saw somebody in the chat saying, of course, government's always directly involved in transportation by its very definition, but not just federal government and state government and local government, which I know many of you work in, really critical about how we're going to implement, how these different states are going to implement, what are they going to do, and are they leaning into innovation? Are we going back to established legacy systems, et cetera? I think a lot of interesting and important questions in terms of the infrastructure bill. Secondly, of course, the CHIPS and Science Act, and as David highlighted, I think the CHIPS Act has gotten a lot of the attention in terms of money, $52 billion going directly to the manufacturing of sort of frontier and legacy chips, as well as an R&D component. And the spillovers and some of that will also touch transportation, I think, and supply chains, et cetera. But the Science Act part of that, which is the part that a lot of folks on this call, I think, weighed in on, also highlights the importance of applied research with a new directorate at the NSF. It highlights 10 different specific technologies that the U.S. thinks that we think need to be invested in, many of them related to advanced manufacturing. And it basically says, we're also care about regions. We're investing in through regional tech hubs and other ways. We want to see opportunities to spread economic development and science and technology capacity outside of our coastal regions. And then the third piece, which I think transportation and mobility is also central to, is the Inflation Reduction Act. People are, I'm sure, familiar with all the climate-related provisions of that act. And it's the one act that was not passed on a bipartisan basis, but it does use a lot of what I'd call market-based strategies to try and crowd in private sector investment. 3/4 of the $340 billion in that act are through tax credits. And so that's an important piece of understanding how are we going to make this transition, and and invest, bring the private sector in, and not necessarily pick the technologies, though some will say, hydrogen really won out in that act, but any technology that is, that it has a zero emission outcome is eligible for these tax credits. So trying not to put the thumb on the scale too much on different technologies. And again, transportation, mobility writ large, very much the sister part, if you will, or central part of the climate imperatives, particularly given that 30% of emissions are driven by the transportation industry. And I also want to just say that while a lot of this is the industrial strategy that is about investing in and choosing particular industries for investment in the United States, transportation, semiconductors, clean energy, critical minerals are also in there. PPE was also part of this broader initiative. I think that the point that the Biden administration has made in many ways is there's no transportation kind of put aside. It's not about building everything in the US. It's about building up capabilities that make the country less vulnerable in key technologies and key industries. So the idea is there's a lot of conversation going on with partners about strategies for semiconductor manufacturing, for example, and an understanding that what we're doing in the US will have significant spillovers, particularly I hope on innovation for the world, but there's friendshoring and nearshoring, and that this strategy of sort of a new industrial revolution is going to be helping this country, but also not at the exclusion, hopefully, of other countries. Another point I want to make is not just the what of this new legislation, but the how. So there's a number of different tools that I think have evolved and represent kind of our thinking, our learning over the years about how do we bring innovation and improve on the investments we're making and bring the private sector along in that process. So there's clearly the supply push of grants that are going out and ways in which we are making available as a country, through many different opportunities for communities to apply for money and push money out the door in many different ways to support this agenda. So the CHIPS money, for example, is going to be large grants with some conditionalities, if people have seen what Secretary Raimondo announced last week. But that's a supply, sort of a push, if you will. The other side is the demand pull of the tax credits, and those we've really leaned into, and I think people would say that perhaps in the clean energy space that we really completed the whole cycle there, not just pushing out money as we have in the past, but trying to provide the demand pull that's going to help technologies and companies grow. We also have a new strategy around demonstration. As many of you know, particularly if you're in the clean tech space, we have had challenges. Anything that has longer development cycles and also high CapEx has not been easy to finance in this country. I think there's a bigger focus now on that scale-up process and how can we bring new technologies to scale and demonstrate at scale. And then finally, also the place-based strategy is cluster-based strategies. We're doing this in hydrogen. We're doing this in other areas where trying to build kind of a portfolio of expertise across this country and support the development of multiple places where we're going to see expertise develop and investment happen. And so the hydrogen competition, where there's, I think it's about 8 billion across multiple places to build up hydrogen capacity is an example of that. So apart from industries and the tools, I also just wanted to highlight, particularly for this group, we're also looking at new institutional developments, which I think are very positive, that if we're going to be looking to develop new models and new ways of doing things, we may also need to shape the way things are done in Washington. And so there is, as I said before, on demonstrations, $21 billion and a new Office of Clean Energy Demonstrations that's been stood up. There's a new joint office between the Office of Energy and Transportation to try and coordinate and understand the interrelationship and interdependency of those two offices. There's a new Office of Manufacturing and Energy Supply Chains at DOE for the first time. You know, manufacturing has historically been kind of the purview of DOD. And now we understand that actually, no, it goes beyond that. It's an issue for DOE and it's an issue for DOT as well. And then finally, authorized but not appropriated, the ARPA Infrastructure Office, which DOT is working on standing up, and the process of getting funding for that, I think, is underway. But that's incredibly, for those who have worked with DOT, et cetera, that's a very exciting new office and a place where driving innovation and coordinating across jurisdictions and with public and private is really a possibility. So that's I think important to recognize, as well as that institutional development. And just to be clear, already we see signals from the private sector that this legislation and some of the funding that's already coming through is already having an impact. $300 billion in semiconductor commitments by the private sector, over $100 billion in EVs and batteries, also additional clean tech investments. So positive signs at this point. So I think all of that's great. It's great to pass legislation, but of course the challenge is now in the implementation. It's the how, not just the what. And just to give a little bit of an example, I think, of something that's kind of going on right now that to me is an example of how this industrial strategy might play out. I think everybody knows that there's basic upgrading and investment in the infrastructure law for airports, for ports, for public transportation, for roads, et cetera. And then a lot of other significant investment in clean tech and in the building out of our energy grid, if you will, or energy infrastructure. So not only money for demonstrating new technologies, but also money that's just gone out, $7.5 billion for EV charging stations. And I think that again, that money's going out to states, and the question is how are states going to use it? Same sort of thing with electric buses that I know Jinhua has been involved with as well. Funding going out for electric school buses. How are states and regions going to actually implement this? And just a quick anecdote on the EV side, EV charging side. I'd say 2 years ago, we did not make EV charging, EV chargers here in this country. But EV chargers fall under the infrastructure law. Infrastructure law has made in America requirements around steel, which is traditionally what's been the case, but also around manufacturing and construction products. And so with this new incentive, if you will, and the signaling from the administration, and the fact that there's a commitment to building chargers, 500,000 chargers before 2030, and the commitments to EVs, et cetera, we now have 11 companies in the country who are in a position to make EV chargers, and are focused, particularly on addressing sort of the range anxiety and other things that exist. And I think that's, we're going to see more of that hopefully play out in terms of capacity building in the country. And I think the work again between government and private sector is a really interesting area. The other point to make, I guess, on the agenda in these bills is that there's a tremendous amount that does focus on innovation in transportation and what needs, what the focus should be, or what the DOT and others have highlighted, like where we think the big challenges exist, whether that's advanced batteries, connected and automated vehicles, electric and hybrid aircraft, high-speed rail, low-carbon shipping, low-carbon heavy-duty on- and off-road vehicles, mobility on demand. These have been highlighted as key areas of interest and opportunity for innovation. But I will say that my experience, and this is where I transition to a little bit of the supply chain stories, is that, it's as, and I think this speaks to our work of the future effort that David and I were involved in. It's not just about the technology. We all know it's not about, just about innovation in technology. And it's really about innovation in processes, innovation in institutions. And so I sort of, as we look ahead at implementation, I would really ask this group to think about innovation broadly and how the work of the Mobility Initiative and others on this call are thinking about and working on the integration, the disruption, all of the things that need to happen for actual adoption. And we know collectively that adoption takes a long time. How can we accelerate that path here? What can we learn from other industries or other places where we've seen adoption work? And it's particularly challenging in the transportation space where there is such a back and forth with the public and private sector. So just to highlight a little bit my experience with supply chain challenges in transportation. I arrived at the White House in April of 2021, and by June it was all hands on deck for what we were seeing at our ports with the backing up of ships, and basically the high point of that was a year ago, January, where we had 109 ships at anchor outside port of LA Long Beach, which of course is the largest port for importing goods from Asia. And I just wanted to, what I would say there is, first of all, we have, I think, $17 billion dedicated to our ports, which is fantastic, but is really a drop in the bucket for those who know the costs of ports. And so it's not like this infrastructure money is going to be transformational for ports. What we need is real reform and innovation in the systems that exist already. And what the problems that existed at LA Long Beach existed there long before the pandemic. They were just exacerbated by what we were experiencing in terms of increased demand, et cetera. And the country suffered. We saw shipping industries, what I would consider, price gouging, but basically raise their prices 20x, break their long-term contracts as they sort of brought empty ships back to Asia and to bring back higher margin goods and basically really crippled our agricultural industry in this country. But very poor management in terms of data sharing, in terms of asset management with the chassis and containers. And as a federal government, we were watching this and trying to figure out what is the role, since there's so little government actually involved in the port system. So we have a very weak regulator, the FMC. We have a Port of LA Long Beach are essentially their landlords. So what we did is we appointed a port envoy. Some of you may have followed John Porcari, Deputy Transportation Secretary in the Obama administration, to help bring a sort of a convening role for the federal government and bring all of the players around the table to talk about ways that we could collaborate and work very quickly to avoid crises during the holiday season. And it's amazing how the threat of a fee on long dwell containers can focus the mind. And it ended up, moving containers and helping avoid massive bottleneck beyond what we had. And it was sort of a lesson to me about how the importance or the role of the federal government in trying to organize at a level in which so many independent players, private sector interests, and the weaknesses of that model, fundamental weaknesses. It led to our first piece of legislation with the Ocean Shipping Reform Act. So anyway, we saved Christmas and got more funding to the FMC, et cetera. And then the other one I just want to quickly mention is rail. That rail continues to be in the headlines, sadly. But the problems with rail and the problems that are deeply related, in my mind, to duopolies and reduced competitiveness are very fundamental to that industry. There's been a decline in performance, that's been noted even pre-pandemic. And there aren't so many tools. We have a regulator that we could use. We've done some convenings and things, but there I'd say, TBD as to how we actually improve rail in this country and what we can be doing as, in this group with this transportation and in this moment to actually improve service and improve also, treatment of workers, et cetera. So I'll stop there. I don't want to go on too much, but a whole, host of things that hopefully we can discuss and work from in terms of this moment, this historic moment for the country.
Great. This is fantastic, Liz and David. So here I highlighted a few professors in the audience here to add. I invite Alan Kornhauser, Professor Dirk Stryker, and Professor Hani Mamasani to add some remarks if you like. A very short one, 1 minute maximum. Before I will start with Alan, please.
Yes, thank you. I mean, yes, you hit the nail on the head of the big problem. I wanted to throw in a couple of things. I wish you'd mentioned GPS satellites, because that was a military thing that I've always thought, oh my goodness, where'd that come from and how valuable is that? But just throw that in. Nobody mentioned nuclear. I won't, but I just did. For some reason, that nobody's allowed to talk about that. I understand why, but it may be a shame. The problem, the challenge is labor. I mean, what are we going to do? Where's our Presbyterian work ethic or whatever? I'm not Presbyterian, so I shouldn't say that. But that's a struggle here, because we have 340 million people or something, and people need to work. They can't work on the farm because they're only 2% or whatever that work on the farm anymore. That people need to work, and what are people going to do? Especially when everything that we're doing is trying to automate, which for obvious reasons we want to automate. Why? Because it's easier to write an algorithm and to tell an algorithm what to do than to tell a person what to do. Maybe, I don't know. But anyway, that's to me, that's the crux of the problem. And then, I don't know how we deal with it. Sorry.
Great, thanks, Alan. Hani?
Yeah, thank you, Liz and David. First of all, I very much appreciate the enthusiasm that you're bringing to this, to this topic and to this conversation. And I'm going to just quickly say that obviously this is a very complex problem with many different actors, particularly the interplay between the public sector and the private sector, because a lot of the technological advances that we have seen and the commercialization and so on has been pretty much driven by the private sector, and government has always played a role, whether direct or indirect, but that is a complex set of interactions. And I'm going to stay within my domain, which is mobility and transportation, and not get into the broader sort of manufacturing side of things. But I'm going to just use one example from my experience, where I'm going to say we've been burned before. And I'm going to say it's the area of intelligent transportation systems, which perhaps Alan could have addressed, where there was a quote, a grand vision and so on, but ultimately it really under-delivered compared to what certainly what the vision was and what the expectation was. And for all of the plans and program that existed, what ultimately appended all of this is that Google/Waymo showed up with an autonomous vehicle when the ITS world was focused on connecting and automated highways. Uber came through with shared, with on-demand mobility, where all of the other visions never really went anywhere. And when it came to electrification, Tesla appended the equation in that space. So there's again a role for both, and you can't always dictate or legislate innovation because there is an entrepreneurial element in it. And how do we achieve all of these synergies, I think is a challenge, obviously. And I think from the standpoint of helping innovation, perhaps, being inclusive in the vision would be important to help advance that, and perhaps recognizing as well that things may come out from where we're not expecting them necessarily, and to keep an open mind when these opportunities present themselves and kind of help advance them. But thank you very much for a very inspiring presentation today.
Thanks, Hani. Dirk?
Yes, there's such a range of different areas that have been touched on, and the question of how you coordinate and define priorities. But to my mind, there's got to be one big priority, because if we don't meet that priority, and we're not doing a very good job of it right now, we're going to find all the rest of it will not even matter. And that is climate change. It is particularly the increase in the CO2 in the atmosphere, and we're way behind schedule as far as any targets and all that have been set and what have you. And we have to think about this, and we have to say, how can we really focus this country, and hopefully, a lot of other countries, on particular areas where we can have some success in climate change. And I just, I think I like to see priorities defined, and I say this is number one priority with 5 stars in terms of importance.
Great, thank you, Dirk. Yeah, given the time, I'll just add one remarks and pass for John for question. Then we'll, in the end, ask Liz and David to summarize and respond to many of these questions there, right? The angle to introduce is the communicative angle, right? So this massive amount of investment, federal government talk about it, at MIT we talk about it, but do an average person in the country talk about it? Should they? Right. So mobility initiative as a institute, what we try to do is bring this discussion to the general public in order, in the end of this implementation, not only build a bunch of a project, but also engage the public in this discussion in this, right? So that's all to say. I'll give it to John to bring the audience questions as well. Yeah.
Super. Well, thanks so much. And again, our chat has absolutely exploded. I'm going to actually start out with a quick question, if I may, which is, I'm curious, Liz and David, if you have any thoughts about the economist Mariana Mazzucato, who's at University College London. I think you're familiar with some of her theories. She talks about the Department of Energy made guarantees for Solyndra and for Tesla. Solyndra was a failure, Tesla was not. I'm just curious, where are the two of you thinking about this topic and some of her theories?
I'm happy to go. She was going to speak at my class yesterday and had to cancel last minute. But anyway, so Mariana's been, one of the few economists who's really put on the table the important role of the government and the role of the government as a stakeholder. That it's not just about addressing market failures, but actually shaping markets and creating markets. And we have a long history of doing that. And so the conditionalities, which is the word she uses, that actually the government has a right to ask for something in return for all of these things, I think is a very fair area for exploration. And I think that you've seen that right now with the CHIPS Act, right? These companies are now going to provide childcare for their workers, which, if you think about the labor shortage we have, and one of the key issues is daycare, this is just solving a labor problem, allowing the policy to actually, succeed. And obviously other countries are a much more generous situation. And if we're not going to create a national system or a state system, this is the way the Biden administration has tied, some of its goals. And I think that's fair. And I think it's also fair to think about stock buybacks and say, that's not how public money, we want public money to be used. So I think she's got a very good, vision there or a plan there. I do feel like she's often talks about mission-driven work, building you need missions. I think the missions that work, and nobody better than David Mindell to talk about an Apollo mission. You need specificity when you want mission-driven work. You need some kind of specific goal that I think is not just about, a more resilient mobility system. So I would just take issue with that point.
That's actually exactly what I was going to say. I like a lot of her ideas. I'm always a little wary of the use of the Apollo program as a model for some of these things, because it had such a simple and well-defined goal, man, moon, decade, as they say. And one of the challenges with a lot of these problems, and it's true in various healthcare aspects, is how do you define a project that has such a simple goal where you can tell by looking at the calendar practically whether it achieved the goal, when those things are when we can define problems. And I do think, a lot of the startups that I see, especially the bigger well-funded ones, take Commonwealth Fusion, they're entirely focused on one goal right now, which is proving that their reactor can work and generate positive gain. And as soon as that happens, they'll transform as a company, but they've got their own Apollo program there. And so, but the larger kind of societal and, of course, climate is so complex. It's one of the challenges of it is it's hard to define a single well-defined goal in that way.
Excellent. Okay, let's see. So many questions. Let me just throw two of them out and you can take whichever one appeals the most. So the first, one question from João Barros, who's an entrepreneur from Portugal. He writes, which revolutions in transportation do you believe would have happened or have happened faster with less government intervention? And what lessons can we learn from that? So that's first question. Second question from Mackenzie Human. How can US government support innovation in a way that balances competition across technologies while also supporting efficient network planning? So two very sort of different questions. Any takers for either of those?
Well, I would address the first one a little bit, looking at aviation, right? Okay. Where, great innovation story. The Wright brothers really had no relationship to government, anything. They were bicycle mechanics. Although, again, you could say that bicycles were supported by government technology from 50 years before. But the military as a customer played a big role in aviation and other aspects of airmail and so on. And it was 30 years before aviation found its kind of commercial product market fit, to use today's language. And what I came away from the work of the Future Project with very much a sense of that 30-year cycle. And it's the 5 to 25 years that you need the government to be patient and provide some structure. And there are other ways to do it, to be sure. Actually, I meant to mention the Rainhill trials in 1829 were the first place where steam had been around for 100 years by that point. And the Rainhill trials were the first place, it was a privately funded competition to build an effective steam locomotive, and was a public event. It was enormously effective in selecting the Stephenson rocket as the winner of that solution. So there are other social forms, but we came away from the work of the Future Project and pretty much everything we've done since that. When you talk about industrial systems, including mobility, these transformations take time, and private capital is not always well suited or structured to support them for that intermediate period. And it's fairly less frequently that they update with the rate of the apps on our phone.
Liz, any thoughts from your side on network economics?
Yeah, I mean, we need them more than ever right now. What I would say is, I think on the clean tech side, people have thought a little bit about this in terms of, competition across technology. The fact is that they're at very different stages of development. So the thought is that solar and wind now are really in a position for deployment, immediately over the next decade plus. It takes 20 to 30 years to get to nuclear and hydrogen, I think, in terms of full adoption in the ways we're imagining. So I think there's a sense of sequentialness here, and also that our needs are so vast, and the transition or the transformation that has to happen is so enormous that there's not so much concern about that we're going to have a crowding out of some technologies over others, at least at this point in time. I think that's not our challenge. And maybe if that's our challenge down the road, maybe that's a welcome one.
Super. Okay. Let's see. Jinhua, do we have time for one more question?
Yes, we have 2 more minutes.
Okay, super. So there is a question about liability law coming from Ellen Partridge. How does liability law impact the development of technology independent of regulation? So I think this is alluding to the kind of litigious nature of our society, and just any thoughts on how we can move into this tectonic shift, this new future, and move away from that.
Yeah, well, I do not have a good answer for that, except that I can tell you that a lot of people have pointed to this problem. So if people, Ezra Klein and others, about we've forgotten how to build. We don't have the capacity to actually build in this country because we have created such a democratic process that it slows down the doing of things. And I think that the numbers about actual investments in grid infrastructure are like 10 to 20 years. So I would say it's very much at the high, it's at people's, people are aware of this, and then how we actually address that, and what has to happen at the state and local level versus at the federal level, I think is in discussion. But there's no question that those are important issues for how we go forward, particularly in things like mining in this country. That'll be, I think, front and center.
I'd also just flip that around a bit and phrase it for certain technologies in terms of safety, and that actually we are woefully behind in our kind of innovation in safety engineering. People are building 21st century safe systems, and we're stuck with trying to safety certify them with techniques from the 70s, 1970s, maybe sometimes the 1870s that are really not applicable. And I don't have the answer to that, but there's 1 or 2 faculty on our campus here who really study safety engineering in a serious way, and there ought to be dozens. We need innovation there.
Great, thank you so much. I hate to disrupt this such an interesting conversation. So Liz and David, thank you again, everybody, to join. Thank